23 red wolf pups were born in eastern North Carolina this spring, which is a strange thing to say about an animal declared extinct in the wild in 1980. 4 dens out in the swamp forest, and the best birth year since 2013. But the number underneath it is the one biologists watch. There are somewhere between 22 and 26 adult red wolves left in the wild, anywhere on Earth. Every one of them descends from 14 animals, and this population nearly died a second time in the last decade because people kept shooting them by mistake. 3 of those 4 litters came from wolves denning on federal ground, in and around Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge on the Albemarle Peninsula. It's flat, wet country out there. Pocosin bog, pond pine, black bear tracks in the mud, and roads that run straight for 20 miles without a curve. The 4th litter is the one the recovery team keeps pointing at because it wasn't born on refuge land at all. It was born on private property, on land enrolled in a program called Prey for the Pack, which pays landowners in the 5-county recovery area to manage their acreage for deer and rabbit, and to let the wolves stay. That matters because the refuge by itself is not big enough to hold a species. The red wolf recovery area is mostly farm and timber ground, owned by people who get to decide what happens on it. So a den on private land is worth more than the pups in it. It means a family of wolves fed up on ground the government doesn't control, and the people who own that ground let them stay. Of the 23 born, roughly 12 to 16 were still alive after the first few months. That sounds brutal, and by human standards it is. For wild canids, it's ordinary. Pups die of disease, of exposure, of predation, of bad luck, and a red wolf litter that gets half of itself to autumn is doing well. So how does a dozen surviving pups become the biggest wildlife story in North Carolina? Because of what this animal already survived, and how close it came to not surviving it again. Start with what a red wolf actually is, because almost nobody has seen one. It's smaller than a gray wolf and noticeably bigger than a coyote, with long legs, tall ears, and a coat that runs cinnamon and gray with a red wash behind the ears. It hunts white-tailed deer, raccoon, rabbit, and nutria. It lives in family packs built around a single breeding pair, and the grown offspring stay to help raise the next litter. 200 years ago, that animal ran across most of the American Southeast, from the pine flats of East Texas up through the Mississippi Valley and into the Ohio River country. Then came the bounty payments, the clearing of bottomland forest for farms, and federal predator control programs that paid men to kill wolves by the wagon load. By the middle of the 20th century, the red wolf was gone from almost all of it. The last of them ended up cornered in the coastal marsh of southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana, in country nobody wanted along the Gulf. And that's where the second problem found them. As the wolves thinned out, coyotes moved east into the vacuum. A red wolf that can't find another red wolf will breed with a coyote. Biologists watched the last wild population dissolving into something that was no longer quite a red wolf. In the 1970s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made a decision that sounds insane on paper. They decided to take the entire species into captivity. Federal trappers worked the Gulf Coast marsh and brought in hundreds of wild canids. Every animal was measured, photographed, skull scanned, and compared against museum specimens. Most of them turned out to be coyotes or hybrids. 17 were judged to be genuine red wolves. Of those 17, 14 bred successfully. 14 animals. That's the entire genetic foundation of a species that once ranged over a dozen states. In 1980, with the last of them behind fences, the red wolf was declared extinct in the wild. The founding stock went to Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium in Tacoma, Washington, which is where the captive program was built and where the red wolf species survival plan was approved in 1984. Every red wolf alive today in the wild or in a breeding facility came out of that program. which means every red wolf alive today is descended from those 14. Hold on to that because it comes back at the end of this story with teeth. The recovery team didn't go straight from concrete kennel to open wilderness. In 1978, 2 red wolves were put out on Bull's Island, a barrier island inside Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge on the South Carolina coast. They lasted 9 months out there, hunting on their own, and that experiment is the reason anybody believed a captive-born red wolf could still make a living in the wild. Bull's Island became the program's first island breeding site in 1987, and pups were born on it the following spring. Islands turned out to be the right training ground because a barrier island comes with a fence made of salt water. Wolves put there can hunt, den, and raise young without wandering onto a highway or into a neighbor's pasture, and if something goes wrong, the team can find every animal on the island. The service later added St. Vincent Island off the Florida Panhandle as a propagation site, and it still runs the same way. A captive-born wolf arrives, goes into an acclimation pen, gets weaned off zoo food and onto whatever lives on the island, and only comes out of the pen when it can feed itself. By the mid-80s, the captive population was healthy enough to gamble with. The question was, where? The recovery team wanted a place with few coyotes, few people, and a lot of prey, and they landed on a peninsula in northeastern North Carolina, a couple hundred miles from the Atlantic beaches at Nag's Head. On September 14, 1987, the first red wolves went out into Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. 4 captive-born pairs held in acclimation pens on the refuge until they had settled, then let loose into the Pocosin. Nothing like it had been tried before. The red wolf became the first carnivore ever reintroduced to the wild under the Endangered Species Act. And every wolf and grizzly and lynx recovery that followed borrowed from what happened on that peninsula. Nobody knew if captive-raised wolves would hunt. They hunted. In 1988, wild red wolf pups were born in North Carolina for the first time in decades. Then the program did the patient, boring, expensive work that actually moves a species. Between 1987 and 1994, more than 60 adult red wolves from the captive program went into the wild population. Field crews trapped, collared, and tracked them. Landowners across 5 counties, Dare, Hyde, Tyrrell, Washington, and Beaufort, ended up with wolves on their property, and most of them tolerated it. That tolerance is the whole ball game, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The 5-county recovery area is not a park. It's soybean fields, corn, loblolly pine plantations, hunting clubs, farm roads, and small towns like Columbia and Engelhard. The federal refuge is one piece of it. The rest belongs to families who never asked for an endangered predator on their back 40, and for years a lot of them shrugged and let the wolves be, because the wolves ate the deer and the raccoons and the nutria and mostly stayed out of the way. It worked. By the mid-2000s, more than 100 wild red wolves were living in eastern North Carolina, in packs, raising their own pups, hunting deer in the Pocosin. A species that had been sitting in concrete kennels in Washington state 20 years earlier was running loose on the Atlantic coastal plain. That's the high point. Everything after it is the part most coverage skips. Before it gets there, the honest objection has to go on the table, because the people who fought this program hardest didn't argue about hunting rules. They argued about whether the red wolf is a real animal at all. The case against goes like this. Genetic studies have found coyote and gray wolf ancestry in red wolf genomes. If the red wolf is a hybrid rather than a distinct species, then the government spent 40 years and a lot of federal money protecting something that isn't a species on private land over the objections of the people who own it. That's not a fringe position. It's been argued in journals and in court. So Congress asked for an independent answer. In 2019, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published its review of red wolf taxonomy, and concluded that current evidence supports classifying the contemporary red wolf as a distinct species. The panel was careful about it. They noted that genetic continuity between today's red wolves and the historic population can't be fully nailed down without genomic data from museum specimens, and that future work could change the picture, not a rubber stamp. But it's the closest thing to a verdict this fight has produced, and it came from a body with no stake in the outcome. Now the collapse. The first crack was the same one that finished the Gulf Coast population. Coyotes reached eastern North Carolina in the 1990s, and they kept coming. A red wolf pack will hold territory against coyotes. A single red wolf, one that's lost its mate, often won't. It pairs with what's available. The recovery team came up with a strange and clever answer. They trapped coyotes inside the recovery area, sterilized them, and put them back. A sterile coyote still defends its territory, still keeps other coyotes out, and can't produce hybrid pups. It becomes a placeholder, holding a piece of ground open until a red wolf can take it. The placeholder strategy worked. It kept hybridization down for years, and it's still one of the more elegant things American wildlife management has ever tried. But it had a load-bearing assumption underneath it. It assumed there would keep being enough red wolves to fill the ground the sterile coyotes were holding. If you've got a trail camera hanging on a tree line anywhere in the Southeast, tell me in the comments what you've been getting and what county you're in. State and animal. I read them. And if you want more of these, the ones about what's actually moving back into American woods, subscribe. Then the shooting started. On paper, the two animals are easy to tell apart. An adult red wolf runs 45 to 80 pounds and stretches close to 5 feet from nose to tail. A coyote in the same county goes 20 to 35 pounds and about 3 feet. The wolf has rounded ear tips, a broad, heavy head, and a paw print roughly an inch wider. The coyote's face narrows down to a sharp point. In the field, almost none of that helps. Both animals come in the same browns and tans and grays. A young wolf and a big coyote overlap in size, and the difference that's obvious in a photograph disappears when the animal is 100 yards out in thick cover. The recovery team knows exactly how bad the problem is, which is why nearly every wild red wolf in eastern North Carolina wears a bright orange tracking collar, and why the sterilized coyotes holding territory inside the recovery area wear black or white ones. Those collars are there to be seen through a rifle scope. Now put the animal at night in a spotlight beam. A temporary state rule opened up spotlight coyote hunting at night in North Carolina, including inside the 5 counties where the only wild red wolves on Earth were living. A Wake County court suspended that rule in 2012 after conservation groups sued, and in 2014, a federal court halted coyote hunting in the recovery area entirely. The damage was already done and it kept going. Gunshot became the leading cause of death for wild red wolves. Since 2012, several shooters who killed a red wolf and reported it told authorities the same thing. They thought it was a coyote. Most of them probably did. And that's what makes this stretch of the story so hard to get angry about. What was running in those 5 counties was a legal night hunt for one animal in the dark over the top of the last 2 dozen of another. And a dead red wolf costs more than one red wolf. Red wolves are cooperative breeders. One pair in a pack breeds, the rest help. Kill a breeding adult in April and you haven't removed one wolf from the count. You've removed that pack's litter, and often the pack itself, because the survivors scatter. The widowed mate goes looking, and in that country what it finds is usually a coyote. That's the mechanism. Adult deaths at the top of packs, and each one taking a family group with it. Then the agency that built the program started taking it apart. Releases from the captive population slowed and effectively stopped. Field management wound down, and the service began issuing permits that let private landowners kill red wolves on their own property. A federal court in eastern North Carolina blocked that practice in 2016. 2 years later, the same court made the block permanent and found the service had violated both the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act in the way it rolled the protections back. While that case was still moving, the service floated a rule that would have shrunk the wild population's legal ground down to the Alligator River Refuge and the Dare County bombing range, a fraction of the original five-county recovery area. Any wolf that walked off that ground could be shot. More than 100,000 public comments came in on the proposal, and nearly all of them were against it. By then, the count that had passed 100 in the 2000s had fallen off a cliff, down to about 7 known wild red wolves. 7. For a species with 14 founders, that's the second time it stood at the edge of the same hole. In 2020, the Red Wolf Coalition, Defenders of Wildlife, and the Animal Welfare Institute sued the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, represented by the Southern Environmental Law Center. The argument was that the agency had a legal duty to actively manage and rebuild this population and had walked away from it. In August of 2023, a settlement was filed in federal court in eastern North Carolina. It committed the agency to produce annual plans for releasing captive red wolves into the wild, to brief the plaintiffs annually on coyote management, and to keep doing it for 8 years, which puts the obligation out to 2030. It's rare for a species to be handed a court-enforced schedule for its own survival. That's what happened here. Then came the technique that actually moves pups into the wild, and it's the strangest tool in the box. It's called pup fostering, when a captive female and a wild female give birth within a few days of each other. The team takes newborn pups from the captive litter, drives or flies them to eastern North Carolina, and slips them into the wild den while the mother is out. Under about 2 weeks old, red wolf pups are close enough in scent and size that the wild female accepts them and raises them as her own. A pup born in a breeding facility grows up wild, hunting deer in the Pocosin, never knowing it started somewhere else. Fostering plus renewed releases of adults is what put breeding pairs back on the ground. Wild litters returned in 2022 and 2023, which brings this back to the 4 dens this spring and the 23 pups, and the best birth year since 2013. Now the fragile part. 2013, the year everyone is comparing this to, produced 34 pups. That was a population with room in it. This year's 4 litters came out of roughly 22 to 26 known adults, and if half of this year's pups reach adulthood, the wild population might climb by a dozen animals. One bad winter, one disease outbreak, one stretch of road kills on Highway 64, and the whole gain is gone. There is a reserve behind them. About 295 red wolves live in zoos and breeding facilities across the country, and that captive population is the only reason a crash to 7 wild wolves wasn't the end of the species. But it carries the same problem the wild population does. 14 founders means the genetic variation inside this animal is thin. And thin genetics means less to work with against disease, against parasites, against the slow cost of inbreeding. Which is why the strangest development in red wolf biology is happening about 1,300 miles away on a barrier island off the Texas coast. In a peer-reviewed study published in 2018, researchers sampling coyotes on Galveston Island found something in the DNA that wasn't supposed to be there. Red wolf alleles, genetic variants that had been written off as gone with the Gulf Coast population in 1980, still circulating in animals that look like coyotes and live behind the seawall and out in the coastal grass. Some of those Galveston canids carry a third or more of their ancestry from red wolves. Researchers call them ghost alleles, genes from an extinct population still walking around in a living one. The wolves that dissolved into coyotes on the Gulf Coast never entirely disappeared. They got carried. and there's now serious work on whether that variation can be pulled back into the recovery program to widen the genetic base those 14 founders left behind. So here's where the rarest wolf on Earth actually stands. Somewhere between 22 and 26 adults in the wild, all of them in 5 counties of eastern North Carolina, all of them descended from 14 animals trapped out of a Texas marsh 50 years ago. A federal agency under a court order to keep releasing more until 2030. 23 pups born this spring, 12 to 16 still breathing, and the ghost of the original population riding along in the blood of Texas coyotes, waiting to see if anyone can use it. If you want to see the animal that filled the hole red wolves left across the east, the coy wolf, that video is on screen now, and it explains why what's in your tree line probably isn't what your grandfather called a coyote.